Hello. Good morning. Welcome to day 3 of Shadot 2020, celebrating 5 years of G5A. My name is Ishan Benegal, and I'm part of Team G5A. Welcome, everybody. For Shadot 2020, we bring together artists who've been an integral part of our community and journey these past 5 years. Community and ecosystem that believes in the possibility of new, unfiltered voices and the possibility of building communities that are equitable, inclusive, and just in thought and expression. In doing so, our endeavor is to enrich people's lives, rebuild resilient and responsible communities, and strengthen the cultural fabric of our community and city. Today's session is titled Kingship and the Ascetic Ideal in Classical Indian Literatures, in conversation with Arshia, Sattar, and Samhita, Arni, moderated by Indira Chadrasekhar. I'll briefly introduce Indira and let her take the session forward. Hi, Indira. Indira is the founder and principal editor of Out of Print, one of the primary platforms for short fiction with connection to the Indian subcontinent. She's involved in a wide range of literary activities. She's the curator of literature at the Kalagoda Arts Festival and is mentor editor at G5A's imprint, which sounds a little familiar. As a fiction writer, she focuses on the short form, drawing deeply on her scientific experience, working with the complex subtleties of biological macromolecules. Indira, over to you.
Thank you, Ishan. Thank you. How lovely to be here at G5A. And to be part of this birthday celebration for 5 years of G5A. I'm going to take a minute, Samhita and Arshia, to just say happy birthday to G5A, and then I shall invite you both on. I just wanted to say that really it's such a privilege to be part of a space like this. I'm filled with a sense of pride and pleasure and joy. I think that G5A has been sort of unique in really trying to devise a space, conceive of a space, create a space and build it up, and then try to work constantly towards the vision that it has created. And of course, I think the one thing that differentiates G5A from many other spaces is it is in a sense an experiment. So along the way, when things are changing and evolving, not working, not moving the direction that you had anticipated, it is sort of like I know my editorial eye is going to rap me on the knuckles now for having too many sort of metaphors, but in a sense it's like a sea beast, you know. It is adapting and changing to the environment, to the dynamics of the world that it's living in, and constantly shifting and putting out new tentacles, if you will, although tentacle has a sort of an aggressive sense to it, but I mean it in the warmest, most receptive way. And so I think that's what makes G5A really rather extraordinarily unique. And I'm so pleased and proud to be a part of it. And I think that this particular session, somehow positioned in the middle of this birthday celebration, where we're looking at the past, at the evolution of G5A, at the wondrous things it has done and achieved, when it's a moment of accolade and pleasure, this particular session, right in the middle of this moment, is also looking, in a sense, to the future. It's looking ahead because it is positioned around this new initiative of G5A, which is the magazine imprint, the literary magazine and art magazine that has been sort of really spearheaded by Ishan. And I have to really commend both Ishan and Shraddha, the editors of the magazine Imprint, for the wonderful work they've done with it and the wonderful launch it's already had and the exciting kind of space it is. So this magazine has a particular sub-initiative, if one can call it that, which are the conversations which began first as an idea of conversations delving into text where you engage with a practitioner. But indeed, since Imprint is a multi-space, it's more than just literature, it's also art and it's video, it's music, it's audio, it's all of those things. It's really engaging with the practitioners of all of these forms of art in trying to investigate, engage, converse around the piece of art, the text, the process, all of those things. And so today, to have this wonderful conversation, we have two marvelous writers, really masters in their field in different ways. Arshia Sattar, whom I'm going to ask you to start your video, if that's what I'm supposed to do, and Samhita Arni, both of whom it's just a pleasure to converse with, and for both of whom I feel that it's somewhat superfluous for me to position myself as a moderator, because really they don't need to be moderated in any way, but really unleashed into the world with their wonderful minds. One of the values of G5A is courage. And I think that one of the very courageous people I know is Arshia Sattar. In many, many ways, now I'm going to get tearful, in many, many ways. But I think most of all, I think here we can focus on one of the reasons she's so courageous is that she has delved into the text of the Valmiki Ramayana. I don't know whether you can see this. It's the Valmiki Ramayana, which I think is quite a brave and wondrous thing to do, to then translate, not retell, but translate this text, this beautiful text, and share it with all of us in today's contemporary world. And furthermore, in this very strange time when we are boxing ourselves, I think, as communities into very rigid spaces that don't allow investigation, examination, return to original text, that lose the meaning of everything that's happening, Arshia stays with the Ramayana and continues to investigate and analyze it with her beautiful writing. And here we have her new book, Maryada, that's just come out. Fantastic title, Maryada, that's just come out, that investigates the idea of one of the most complex concepts, I think, there is, that emerges from the epics, dharma. And so today, to talk about the idea of dharma in the context of the Ramayana, in the context of the epics, and in the context of the contemporary, is Samhita Arni, the author. Well, first of all, proudly I can say, my niece. I always try to extract a little glory from her glory. And the author of The Prince, that actually I should ask you to hold your copy up, Sam, because it just won a big award and now has a nice big sticker on it saying winner of the Neve Award for literature, and which is, we'll get into it in a minute, but which is really looking into a period which is a millennium after the period that Arshia wrote about, but looking at it from a millennium later. And so there we have all of these contexts, all of these layers, and I have talked for too long. We're dying to hear Arshia and Sam. And so I'm going to start by asking you to really maybe address immediately the idea of kingship and ascetics and asceticism, and what it is that you are really talking about when you talk about power and renunciation. Arshia.
Thank you, Indi. Hi, Sam, again. This is quite like a living room conversation, so that's nice. Yeah, power and kingship and asceticism. In every society, from as long as we have records that enable us to think appropriately and accurately about the past, and those are very, very important adverbs, appropriately and accurately, because we know what's happening currently in terms of how our historical past is being revisioned and lots of it being erased. Anyway, so from time immemorial, there has always been a tension between spiritual power and temporal power. And who is really the boss? Is it the guy who gets you to heaven into the afterlife, or is it the guy who makes it good for you here? So the guy who makes it good for you here is the king. And in Hindu society, among other societies, kings are from the warrior class. In India, of course, class becomes caste. And the priests are, of course, for us, the Brahmins, right? So there is a natural tension between the Brahmin, between the priest and the warrior, and for very, very obvious reasons. And I believe now, after all these years of being primarily with Ramayana, but also increasingly now with Mahabharata, that I think that's exactly what the epics are trying to. They're not resolving it, but they're making it clear to us that, look, this is where the primary social tension lies, right? Because, of course, they're not interested in Dalits or, anything outside the caste system. They're only interested in the Chaturavarna, the four major castes. And we know that in the Vedic period, the supremacy of Brahmins was very, very firmly established. But by the time we get to the Upanishads, and certainly by the time we reach the epics, the epics are warrior books. They are about how to be king. They're about who should be king. There are battles in epics. There are righteous battles, depending on which side you're on. And I think, so the epics certainly reflect this. But I think the texts that Samhita works with, which, as you said, are, a millennium and a little bit more than a millennium after the classical Sanskrit texts, I think they deal with the same issues. I was thinking even of Silapadiharam, which is the base text, really, isn't it, Sam, for the prince? The question is, who should be king? What should a king be? And who is the person to keep him accountable? Is that a fair reading, Sam, of Silapadiharam and the other texts that you work with?
Absolutely. I think that's, I think that the Silapadikaram is really delving into this idea of the relationship between Dharma and kingship.
Yes.
One of the lines that it begins with is, Dharma comes to kings in the form of death, which is scary.
No, I remember that line. I was just thinking like, wow, this is not a great incentive to be a king, no? Yeah, but it is, in the epics, the Sanskrit epics, I should say, the Hindu Sanskrit epics are really about the destiny of the warrior, and because we're not dealing with ordinary warriors, we're dealing with ruling class warriors. It is what is the destiny of the king. Right, and there are ways, I think, in which we can say that dharma and destiny impinge upon each other very powerfully. And of course, there's no better way to see this. There's no better way to think about these huge, big ideas than in a narrative. It's so much easier to convey complex relationships and complex interactions between philosophical ideas in a story than it is to, I mean, that's always been my preference. You know, when I was in college in Bombay, I thought I was being really cool and I wanted a degree in philosophy, and I got a degree in philosophy. And then, you know, in my mid-20s or my early 20s, I was suddenly like, I don't need to do this, man. I can talk about the same ideas by reading stories. And of course, that changed my life, and I've stayed with stories ever since. So I do believe that the epics, the Sanskrit Hindu epics, really play with the ideas of dharma and karma and destiny and personal responsibility and accountability and all of those that constellation, not simply of thought, but also of action, that is really quite unique to Hinduism because of the parallel existence of dharma. That's what you should do, and karma, the thing that you actually do, right? And some, I mean, we've talked about this before, these ideas really do come, well, I can't say they, okay, let me put it this way, that Buddhism, Jainism, and the Upanishads and early Hinduism share a vocabulary of ideas, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. But how they differently interpret these ideas is quite different. I mean, you were talking about the righteous battle and the destiny of the warrior being the destiny of the king. Buddhism seems to, I mean, Buddhism and Jainism invert that. They reject that, and I think that's also comes into this Shilapatikaram as well. That the king himself has to, where it is questioning the challenging the king, and I see that is very different from the Ramayana. Is that in these texts, whether it's the Shilapatikaram, whether it is the Kundalakesi, the Manimekalai, all of these texts challenge the might of the king, and in do so actually challenge the kind of social structure, and also the question of what dharma do you espouse, whether it is a from reading Maryada, how important the caste based dharma is there. These texts look at it, I think, very differently, or respond to that question very differently.
That's a very, very important point, that the southern texts really challenge the idea of kingship. I mean, nothing more so than Shilapatikaram, where, she tears off her breast and sets the city on fire because the king has failed to be just. And not because he's a bad guy, he just didn't do enough investigation before he had somebody executed for a crime he didn't commit, and also, of course, in the southern texts, which we really, really miss in the northern texts, is the power of women and the power of women's speech, which is also a challenge to a patriarchal, militarized idea of rulership and kingship. And in fact, speaking of militarized kingships, I mean, my favorite book of yours, The Missing Queen, is such a brilliant investigation of what it's like to live in a patriarchal, militarized nation, So I think that, when you spend as long with a series of, or a genre of texts like you have and I have, then these things become very, very apparent, right? And also, even though we think of Ramayana particularly and Mahabharata a little less, so we think of them as conservative texts. We think of them as status quoist texts. But because we don't read them for ourselves, we don't realize how many questions they contain within themselves, how they are deconstructing, in fact, the paradigms that they have helped to create. And one of the ways, of course, that is done in both northern and southern texts is through the figure of the ascetic or the sage. And in Buddhism, very powerfully, the figure of the renunciant, who is, one step further along the path of enlightenment than even the sage. And in Ramayana and Mahabharata, the idea of exile, and the fact of exile, is huge. Both these men who would be king, Rama and Yudhishthira, are sent into exile. And I think that's a very important thing. It's not that they go voluntarily. It's not like, oh, you know what, I need to think a little bit, I'm going to sit in the forest, right? Which is what the historical Buddha and, 24 Tirthankaras before even the historical Buddha, before Mahavira, they actually chose to go into the forest because they said, no, you know what, I want to think. Anyway, our kings did not do that. They were propelled by destiny or, whatever.
Yes.
Into the forest. But once Rama and Yudhishthira were there, they got really quite involved in the lives of the sages, and the lives of the sages, the quietism of those lives, the possibility for intellectual companionship, the reality of simple lives became a very attractive alternative, really, to both Rama and Yudhishthira. And that's something that we don't acknowledge enough.
That's really, really, really fascinating, actually, because I think that I know from Maryada, for example, that you that stepping away from the environment in which they are leading their lives of kingship. And then moving into the forest, into another space, into another environment, really changes the way in which they begin to perceive of themselves. And it's the moment of growth, or the period of growth, as you said. But I'm so curious as to why these texts then actually do begin to, what is the source? You've already addressed the idea of the Buddha and Mahavira and the fact that they have their lives and their presumably they were historical figures, and that their lives are actually perhaps impacting the progression of these texts. That is fascinating, really, yes.
No, I have no doubt at all, because, the Ramayana and Mahabharata were being composed or put together like about 100 years after the historical Buddha had lived and preached and, changed the world around him and died. It's also the period of the Upanishads. The Upanishads and the epics are actually being composed in parallel, which is fascinating because you have two very different philosophical trajectories running at the same time. The Upanishads are about quietude, about reflection, about internalized. The search for knowledge is internalized rather than externalized. Again, that's an idea that Buddhism and Jainism share with you. So, and as Sam and I were talking just yesterday, we know that in the Upanishads, there's already been a shift of power. It's not the Brahmins who hold power anymore. First of all, you're responsible for your own spiritual education, but also there are kings who are wise, Janaka, Ajatashatru, and Janaka and Ajatashatru also appear in Buddhist texts, in Jatakas and in, the sort of texts that surround the Tripitaka. And we forget how closely Buddhism, Jainism, and early Hinduism, how closely they lived and grew together, in opposition to each other perhaps, but certainly at the same time. And Sam, you have a similar experience of the presence of Buddhism, and how it inflects the text that you're working with.
Yeah, the sequel to the Silapatikaram is the Manimekalai. Silapatikaram is a Jain text. Manimekalai is taking the same characters but adapting them to Buddhism. So there is that same time, that parallel, that conversation going.
And but also, sorry, Sam, if I could just interrupt, maybe for the audience, you can sort of tell them a little bit about the prince at the right moment, but you were going to ask Arshia something, so I didn't mean to interrupt. But at the right moment, maybe you can also tell them how it's this rather extraordinary thing where what you've done is you've looked at a text, as we already said, which was, a millennium or so or more after the Ramayana and the Mahabharata were written, and actually inscribed, written down. And then what you've done is you're now looking at it from a contemporary time. You're looking at it from the now and reimagining the characters that were living at the time. So it's rather really sort of looping through in a most extraordinary way of looking at text. And I think that, yes, so therefore talking about these texts from the South, that whose characters you are then now reimagining is rather extraordinary. So
thank you. Thank you. Yeah, to put it in a nutshell, it's historical intrigue to do with writers and why they write. But in this particular case, the prince is actually someone who renounces his claim to the throne and chooses to become a monk, so ascetic, and write this very erotic epic that featured two very strong women. But that's actually one of the questions that I had for Arshia, because when she was talking particularly about the power of women in speech, and I was thinking about what she had written in Maryada, about the kind of, you have Surpanaka on one hand and you have Ahalya on the other hand, and these are very two different ideas of sexuality and women's desire. But I think something you said there that really struck me: there is no space for a woman's desire in this framework. Surpanaka is mutilated and Ahalya is turned into stone. And I was struck by this, because what then is the dharma? I mean, and this is moving aside from kingship and asceticism, but I think it's also important because Sita in some ways also kind of has an ascetic aspect to her. Swayam Prabhu that you talk about also has this ascetic aspect to her. So what is dharma for women? Do we also is it a complete rejection of desire and becoming ascetic? And that's so very different from the dharma of a king who has to acquire artha and kama and explore all of that. But there is no space for women to do the same or to follow the purusharthas in the same way.
Surprise, Sammy, there's no place for women in the story. I mean, just as you said right now, when you said purushartha, yeah, these are the goals of life for men. They're not striyarthas or, mahilarthas or anything like that. And I think enough said. But I do think you're making a very valid point that how is a woman's dharma circumscribed, right? And of course, the warrior has many potential destinies, but a woman has one, which is marriage. Yeah, it's a conjugal destiny. And if a woman does not perform the contract of conjugality, then she will be punished, right? Shurpanakha will be mutilated, Ahalya will be cursed, hundreds of other women in the epic are constrained or restrained for, the behaviors that they have indulged in, as it were. So dharma is not really an issue for a woman. I mean, you have a dharma as a patni. Right. In fact, one of the words for wife is dharma patni. No, I mean, we say, ye aapki dharma patni hai, right? But we don't say aapka dharma pati hai. We say aapke pati dev hai. Right now, these, I mean, not to make too much of this, but also let's not pretend that we have not constructed neologisms like this. Know how we describe people, what vocabulary we use to speak of a woman and to speak of a man is much more telling than you would imagine. So we do need to consider that the dharma of women is a domestic dharma.
Which is why, in an interesting way, again, I'm digressing, I apologize, but from that previous set of sessions that you had with James on the Greeks, which was called Blood Brothers, rather ominously.
Not sisters, because there weren't any sisters there, man.
But which is why I found the Buckeye so fascinating, because again, there are all these constraints, there are roles which women have to conform to and live by in the Greek epics as well. And yet finally in the play, the Buckeye, it's about the women just releasing themselves from those constraints and going wild. And I find it so interesting that in a way, whatever such stories might have existed in the epics, they seem to have been whitewashed out.
But there's another kind of misogyny involved in in the vision that the Buckeye has for women.
Of course.
Either they are like, completely submissive and, or they're raging.
Yes.
They're out of control and they're drunk and they're, eating the living flesh of animals and, so I think the Buckeye expresses another kind of cultural anxiety.
Absolutely, but it's just that even allowing for the vision of that release of women, even though now it's framed in all the disapproval and the judgment of written by a man, all the same, it allows for that expression, and so that was the interesting thing. And here, I guess it's only the Rakshasis who have that. Yes.
When we read in Valmiki and of course in Kamba as well, if you read Sundarakanda, in Kamba Ramayana, Sundara is the most beloved Kanda, right? And people read it during, I think that there's a month in the year where you sit and read Sundarakanda just because, of course, you cry and cry because it's so beautiful. You cry for its beauty. But Sundarakanda is located in Lanka and it's located among the women. Hanuman happens upon Ravana's harem when he's looking for Sita. So we move from this incredibly lush and opulent space, redolent with like food and drink and, sort of literally littered with, women, each more beautiful than the one before. And then we leave that with Hanuman and then we go to Ashokavatika, where we have the ascetic Sita. She is living as an ascetic. She, her hair is in one long braid. She's not wearing, any garments of royalty or anything. Anyway, she was abducted from the forest where she was already wearing ascetics clothes, right? The sensuality and passion are all located with the Rakshasas in our epics. Think of Hidimba in Mahabharata, how she seduces Bhima and she's come there to kill him so that her brother can eat him, and she falls in love with him. Because he, and he is, of all the characters in the epics, of all the human characters in there, he is the most Rakshasic. He is most Rakshasa-like in his appetites and in his, the ways in which he kills people, the kind of warrior that he is, all that. But yeah, it's in Indian stories, we have a location, we have a place to put sensuality, which in Greek, as you point out, it stays within the text. It sort of seeds and bubbles and all that. And we can just move it aside. It's like a bookshelf. It's like, okay, my books on sex will be here. My books on kingship will be here. My books on renunciation will be here. It's like that. We do separate our texts. And I think also because Sanskrit culture is obsessed with taxonomies,
It's creating oppositions. I feel like we put karma and asceticism in opposition to each other. We don't really ever see them. We see them as opposites, where they're not necessarily, unless you're talking about the figure of Shiva as the one who breaks that. But we see these in terms of polarities. You can't be one and the other.
Absolutely. It's dangerous mixing,
Yes.
The other thing that really, when you were talking that this has actually been in the beginning of my head from the beginning of the session that I wanted to ask you about. Was you say in Maryada, you talk about how Yudhishthira and Ram both go into exile, and there are both these models of kingship, and they both seem to enjoy in some ways the actual act of exile, the actual act of being an ascetic, and prefer it to kingship. I would love to get more of your thoughts on this. What is it about that space that is so attractive for them?
Well, they both leave their kingdoms in very unfortunate ways. Rama is like on the day of his coronation, the night before, his father and stepmother say, guess what, guy? Not only are you not going to be king, but you have to go live in the forest. Yudhishthira goes into exile after what is surely the most humiliating experience that any king could possibly have, or any potential king. He's gambled away his wife. He's lost everything, down to the clothes on his body. And the exile is a very profound manifestation of his inability to be king. He cannot be a king if he's going to behave like this, So both of them come into the forest, both Rama and Yudhishthira, with lots of things to think about. There's no reason for Rama to believe that after 14 years, Bharata will hand over the kingdom to him peacefully, which of course Bharata does, because he's an exceptionally wonderful person, Bharata. Much ignored. Yudhishthira comes into the forest with an even heavier burden, which is he knows that when he goes back, he's going to have to fight. Yeah, the war is coming. Even Yudhishthira, who is such a peacenik and who does everything in his power to prevent this, even he knows that there's going to be a war. So imagine you leave these turbulent times behind, right? You have an uncertain future. I mean, you know that it's going to take 14 years in the forest, or 13 plus 1, right? But you don't know what's going to happen after that. Wouldn't you want to be in the forest, Sam? Wouldn't you like to just hang about and like have, philosophical discussions with people who are smarter than you? And
that's Cooktown, Arshia. That's where we live.
That is so true. That is so true. Yes, we live in our own little forest of ideas, don't we? Yeah, we are so fortunate. But I think that is one of the things that attracts them enormously. The fact that there is time to think about what they've left behind and what they're going to, and how they might negotiate the new place that they enter when they come back to their kingdoms. And also, Yudhishthira has consistently been exposed to violence of all kinds. Rama has just experienced a really transformative emotional violence. No, I mean, nobody beats him or nobody takes out weapons with him, but he's been betrayed by his father. His, stepmother has proven to be unexpectedly ambitious. And so they both use the opportunity of being in the forest to think about violence. And of course, the sages have abjured violence. They've given it up. They're doing all this ascetic practice and they're eating roots and fruits. And, and Rama, of course, comes into the forest. A Kshatriya, they kill deer and boar and they eat them. And when he's confronted with this other life and he sees how peaceful they are, he thinks like, wow, maybe I could do this. And of course, Yudhishthira, when he's in the forest, Draupadi has to keep reminding him, hey guy, remember what happened to me? Remember how I was humiliated? Why don't you prepare for war? Your cousins are doing it. You're just sitting here talking to people. Arjuna's gone away. Bhima's not doing anything, So Yudhishthira really, really, really takes on the behaviors of the sages that he sees around him. Rama doesn't have that opportunity quite so easily because, of course, his wife is abducted, and then he has to become a Kshatriya again to win her back. But how does it work in your text? How does this dynamic play itself out? I mean, in Prince, you've done it fantastically because there are two brothers, right? One who wants to be king and the other one who doesn't want to be king. And so that dynamic of appropriation and renunciation is placed within a family. So the challenge comes from within the family, not from another order of being, not from another kind of person, no? And Udayan, of course, I remember really, really having a lot of emotions for Udayan when I was reading The Prince. He's a beautifully drawn character, but he's also, he's so noble. What were you doing when you were kids? Is this your ideal man or something? Okay, here's my marriage advertisement, people. This is a guy I want to marry. Somebody show up. Something like, really, how did you make this Udayan fellow?
Yeah, it was a post-breakup novel. So yes,
Oh,
you were
really? Oh my goodness. Okay, well, there you go.
So you needed a good man in your life, Sam.
That's quite wonderful, actually. That you create the man you want, right?
yeah, in fiction, if nothing else. Yes.
Nothing else. Yeah. You should send
But
it out as a how-to manual. Like a self-improvement manual. It's not fiction. Just tell them to move it in the bookstore. To the other section. Yeah.
Actually, yesterday I was talking to James, of course, about this session, and I was saying, we're talking about the prince and Maryada and the epics and so on. And James said, "Oh, kingship and asceticism," and he said, "Yes, the prince, the Udayan is a poet." So then he said, "What caste do you have to be a poet?" And I said, "I'll ask Arshia, sir."
You go first, Sam, because I think I have a very proper dharmic answer.
So I'll give you the Sangam literature response, which is that there's a story. The Sangam itself is the coming together of all of these poets in these great literary geniuses, and that community is itself the Sangam. But there's a story that begins with the goddess Saraswati. Wanting to reincarnate, and she's going to be reincarnated as these poets, as the Sangam itself. And so she divides herself into as many letter parts as there are letters in the Tamil alphabet. And she goes into the tongues of different people, of men from upper caste, lower caste, different communities, villagers, weavers, women as well. We have women poets in the Sangam. And contemporary with, we think contemporary with the time of the Silapatikaram. We have Avayar. So all of these are coming together. And that is the response. Yes, they can be of any caste, they can be of any community. Women are still an extreme minority, but they exist.
That's beautiful.
That's so lovely. Yeah, that is so lovely. I'm going to be the sort of Shastri pedant, which of course is laden with irony, given who I am in relationship to Hinduism. We have a category, a caste, as it were, of bards, the Sutta, right? Who is the king's companion? He's his charioteer, and he's the one who eulogizes the king. But when we think about the people, when we attribute authorship to Valmiki and Vyasa, their bardiness is taken away from them completely. They're great sages, they're like so intellectual. Vyasa divided the Veda. We Brahmanize them, I mean, literally in the flash of an eye. But one of the things that I've always found very moving, and I use this a lot when I teach survey courses in Hindu literature and Hindu religious ideas, is the opening hymn of the Rig Veda. Rig Veda 1.1 is, of course, the hymn to Agni, and they invite Agni down to the sacrifice. And Agni, of course, is a Brahminical god. But in the 8th verse of 12, in that hymn, it says, "I praise the poet, I give thanks to the poet." And I'm like, man, this is brilliant. Yeah, the first expression of what we now call Hinduism includes a poet. And I find that very, very, very moving. And that's not something that we recall terribly often. Of course, there isn't an opportunity to recall it, And the other thing, of course, is nobody reads Vedas, so what do they know? What's actually in there.
It's wild.
But so I think that the idea of the poet is a very, very powerful idea, because the poet is also, as we know, not simply in Vedic times, but certainly, even now, and in the series of conversations of should art, the poet has the power to speak the truth. Right? And I'm always a little disturbed by this current cliche, speaking truth to power. I would really like to, in a Wittgensteinian way, invert the elements in that sentence. So, no, it's the power to speak the truth. It doesn't matter who you're speaking to. And that power really does reside with the poet. And whether it comes from Agni or Saraswati or whoever it is, we acknowledge that the poet has a very, very special place in society in general. And I mean, you know, it doesn't matter whether you're our blood brothers in Greece or, you know, our, I don't know, our counterparts in China or Iceland or, you know, Zimbabwe or anywhere. Yeah.
Well, I think we should start some sort of a process by which we write this imaginary set of poems of all these kings yearning to be ascetics for their hidden verses. I'll just check to see if we have any questions so that we admit in an audience, and then we will continue our conversation. We have Vritika saying, now with no kings really left. Oh, is that true? And those in power, quote unquote, elected. How does one take these ideas to make them contemporary? We try to separate politics from religion and spirituality. So how do we take these texts forward today? So would you both like to address that?
Well, I'll just give a very quick response. Have you seen recent pictures of our Prime Minister? I don't think he's separating religion from politics at all. I mean, look at his wardrobe, look at his costuming, which started actually overtly before the last election when he went and, you know, sat in that Himalayan cave wearing saffron, ostensibly meditating just before we were casting our votes. So I think certainly in India, the idea of the ascetic is still extremely powerful in the Indian imagination, and certainly in the imagination not simply of our Prime Minister, but of the party and the ideology that he represents.
And yes, and I think it's also extremely we have a number of other questions, but it's also extremely interesting positioned as we are at this moment when the US elections is in sort of ferment, how little that I mean, how complex and ugly the connection to spirituality is there. But I will just see what the other questions are.
Did you want to speak to the Vritika's question as well?
I think you summed it up perfectly. I mean, absolutely, like the ascetic ideal is something that we're still following here. But I also think of the idea of sexual morality and how it plays out with kingship, because, you know, Ram is very clear that he's you know, this idea that Sita might even be, is her chastity is questioned. That's a big thing. But in the Shilapatikaram, the reason the king is unjust and the reason the king fails to actually do the right thing is because he's distracted because the queen and he has a quarrel because he had eyes on a specific dancer. And this is a theme that keeps showing up in Sangam literature. The king has an eye for a dancer, and this is what happens as a result. And I think that's interesting to bring up in the context of the US elections. We certainly have a presidential current president whose sexual morality I would question. But and this, I don't know, I feel like this is a theme that keeps coming up when we talk about power, when we talk about Me Too, when we talk about men and power and sexual morality and ethics. I don't have a clear response to that, but I'm also thinking that there might be an aspect of this that we have to think about, that perhaps the Ramayana, you know, and these kinds of discussions can shed on the nature of leadership. Actually I had a question for Arshia, which Vritika's question kind of triggered, if I may. And that was, you know, in this time, I mean, how do we think of dharma and how do we think of ethics and integrity? Because these are issues that I feel like I have to constantly deal with in my life. What is the ethical response to this? What is the ethical response to that? What is the ethical constantly? And another word for that, I guess, I don't know how dharma is such a complicated term, but how does dharma fit into our lives today? And particularly when I'm reading Maryada and I'm seeing the different kind of the conflicts of dharma. Do I do my dharma as a son, or my dharma as a husband, or my dharma as a king, or my dharma as a prince, or my dharma as a caste? My caste dharma, which dharma overtakes what? And how do I prioritize these different dharmas? How do you feel about that today? How is this question, I mean, and how do we link this to the way we live our lives today, this question of dharma?
I don't think, unfortunately, that there's a formula table which shows us which dharma to prioritize. And I'm actually very glad for that, because then the responsibility for being ethical is entirely yours. If you do something bad, you can't say, oh, the good book told me to do that. Or, my Guruji told me. It's like, no, you did it. And you think about why you did this. And I think, there are so many ways to think about what defines the human condition, right? And I think that if we are going to live our lives as fully as possible, what defines the human condition is choice, right? And I think also that's why the women's movement is so determined that choice is ours. Whether it's, what to do with my body, who I marry, like whether I talk about whether you assaulted me or not, these are all issues of choice, right? And choice, of course, I think it defines the human condition, but choice is what gives us dignity, and of course it puts us into all kinds of existential conundrums about what should we do. What is the right thing to do? And I think that, for people like ourselves, Sam, who are entirely metropolitan, we have no village roots, right? Our families have been metropolitan for so long. Certainly, you and I have grown up with all manner of privileges. We've lived in different parts of the world. We've had the best education. We are empowered to do the things that we want to do in this lifetime. Yeah. So for us, dharma becomes all the more complicated because we are not participating in approved categories of being. We are neither acting out of gender, nor are we acting out of caste. Right? These are the things that we work very, very hard to overturn. And in doing so, we've put a far greater moral responsibility on ourselves than other people, who act through gender and caste roles. So yeah, and you know what? I'm really glad. I want to be morally responsible for my own behavior. I don't want to say, oh, mommy told me, or like, teacher told me, or any husband told me. That's the worst of all, right? Papa told, husband told. So I think it. I'm really interested actually in what's happening in the larger world in terms of identity politics, here and of course in the West, right? And if we are going to exist more and more in fluid categories, gender fluid categories. This is interesting. Gender is fluid, but race is not. Race is the one thing. It's like, no, you can't be black, right? But I can be, multiply gendered in this very moment. But as
caste is not fluid at all either.
Caste was not fluid at all. Yeah, absolutely, exactly.
Yeah.
So I do wonder how, for us, dharma is so linked to who you think you are. Right? And if we begin to think differently about ourselves in terms of our primary categories of being, what dharma are we going to choose? What is Shikhandi's dharma, for example? Right? Reborn, Amba reborn, born as a man who is brought up as a woman. No, excuse me, born as a woman who's brought up as a man. She studies with her brother Drishtadumna. She's, she's the catalyst for the death of the greatest warrior of them all, Bhishma. What dharma is this woman to follow, yet? And we don't even ask the question of her. But Draupadi is like, oh yeah, see, you are married, you have to behave like this. And of course, she most powerfully, Draupadi herself asked the question when, after the Vastraharana, and she looks at Bhishma and Vidura and she says, you are the great kings, you are my elders, you are my family. Tell me, Bhishma, is this dharma? And Bhishma typically is like, oh, what can I say? Dharma is so subtle, it is sukshma. It's like, say something, old man, Sorry, that was quite a complicated.
No, I'm so grateful for that because it sparked so many other thoughts for me.
Yeah. A new book, Sam, a new book. Yay.
Yeah. Particularly how our generation is, how much dharma is linked to the identity you choose.
Yes. Absolutely. Very profound. And it's so complicated. There's no easy answer.
I'm so glad, I'm so glad there isn't an easy answer because easy answers stop us from thinking. Right? And there's a point at which, oh, I got the answer to this. It's like the mathematics sum, the arithmetic sum and all, like, okay, there is only one answer and it is this one. I'm so glad that dharma is not like that. Because also, even within traditional understandings of dharma in Hinduism, your dharma changes not simply with who you are, but what stage of life you're in. So when you are a brahmachari, this is your dharma. But the same person as a gruhastha has to behave with a completely different set of choices, right? So I think, and I mean, as we get older and we look back on our lives, I think all of us can reasonably say that we have changed. Right. And one of the reasons we have changed is because we've made the choices that we did make. Right. And those choices have made us who we are. And then this new Arshia has a new horizon of choices. And depending on what I choose, then, it goes on like that. Yeah.
Yes. Well, there is another question from Priyanka saying, the common idea represented through these exiles into the forest is often looked upon as suffering in popular interpretations. In your readings, do you find a deeper meaning? I mean, I think you have talked about it a little bit, but maybe you want to to sort of revisit that a little bit. She talks about Jainism and Buddhism and renouncing.
Well, certainly in Ramayana Mahabharata, the exile is a punishment, right? Rama is effectively, taken out of the picture by being sent to the forest for 14 years. Yudhishthira is punished for his absurd behavior at the gambling match. But as we were saying, once these guys get to the forest, they kind of enjoy it. Certainly Rama and Yudhishthira do. Draupadi is miserable in the forest, right? She hates it. She hates their food. She hates their hut. She has the clothes that she has to wear. Sita, on the other hand, Sita enjoys the forest. She really does. And she makes one of her most beautiful, beautiful speeches to Rama in the forest, where she speaks really the only time she speaks as a woman and not as a wife or a sister or a daughter or whatever. And she says, don't do this, man. Don't carry these weapons. If you carry weapons, you will call violence to yourself. Right? And Rama says, yeah, okay, you're right. But of course, he doesn't do anything. And the next thing that happens is that they meet Shurpanakha, and those very weapons that Sita had been worried about are used to horrendous consequences, in the encounter with Shurpanakha. Again, when we think about locating exile, as it were, in the context of Jainism and Buddhism, the Tirthankaras, the Buddha himself, they went to the forest out of choice, right? And whatever physical privations they suffered, I didn't want to use the word suffered, but there it comes. The various physical privations that they subjected themselves to were not seen as suffering. They were seen as a way of transcending the body, a way of reaching a truth that is that we do not have access to in our daily lives of busyness and whatever. The forest is a complicated place in the Indian imagination, in the Indian epic imagination, in the classical imagination. Because, on the one hand, we say, Are, Vanaprastha, it's so nice, certainly if I'm in that moment in my life where I should be thinking of going to live in the forest, right? I'm at the Vanaprastha threshold, as it were. And so it's full of sages and good thoughts and simple living. But it is also the place of Rakshasas. It is the great unknown. And terrible things can happen to you there. And you can meet creatures that you have not understood. You can't even imagine that such creatures existed, right? So the forest is a liminal space in the truest sense of the word, if we want to be psychological about it, we can say the forest gives you what you most want, or it responds to your greatest fear. So if you go into the forest thinking, Are Bapre, sher hai, bhalu hai, hati hai, then the Rakshasas will come for you. But if you go into the forest saying, oh, well, what if I could be a different kind of person? And the sages will emerge. Yeah, so the forest is a place of the imagination, you know.
I was just thinking as you were saying that it's like a great metaphor for the subconscious as well.
Yes. It is. Yeah. You see what you want to see, you know. So.
Yes, exactly. Another question. I have so many questions. From each little bit of conversation, I have so many questions, but I should be a good interlocutor here and look at the next question, which is, Priyanka again just asked, I suppose, related the tribal retellings of the mythologies. Do they have similar gender interpretations? That's a very large question to answer, but I'm sure you could possibly touch upon it somehow too.
Different. I mean, if I think of Sita's Ramayana, which is a very and that the focus of the story there is on Sita's experience, and I think she becomes a parallel for a lot of the women who themselves feel dispossessed by caste, by gender, by all of these things, and Sita then becomes this figure who articulates or becomes a voice for the commonly voiceless or disenfranchised. So I think that's a very different perspective.
Mm-hmm. And that's told by the maybe you can explain where Sita's Ramayana is. Well, there's your version of Sita's Ramayana, but it
comes out of the Patua tradition, which is the folk oral visual painted tradition in Bengal. The Patuas wander from village to village with these giant scrolls, and they sing their Ramayana, which starts off with Sita being abandoned in their forest, being an orphan, being all of those sorts of things. And I think a lot like Nabanita Devsen, Velacheru Narayan Rao, they've all talked a lot about, women's Ramayanas and how those voices shift dramatically, where this focus suddenly comes into sometimes into abandonment, sometimes into depicting Sita as the orphan who is abandoned. So that's becomes a metaphor for everyone who's excluded from the system. So I think that's quite powerful.
Yes. There are two more questions, and maybe I'll read them both out, and then we can work with those. They're quite different. Sukriti says in Maryada, which I desperately want to read now. She says, "Yay, go get it." You've indicated how these epics don't really prescribe what is right or wrong, what is the right kind of dharma. It's a multiplicity of appropriate choices, which was the phrase you used. But do you think that the ideas of dharma and karma themselves that were perpetuated by this concept of reincarnation are inherently oppressive, especially in the context of upholding caste hierarchies and justifying gender, caste-based exclusion? Who is anyone really, is anyone really free to choose? And a second question from Kritika, I'll just read that out too. Did kings of different castes approach kingship differently in literature and in history? So they're two quite diverse but interesting questions, strong questions.
Okay, Sam, you can take the kings and history question, since you are a way better researcher than I am.
Oh my God, Arshia, you were just saying that to give me the question, and I have no idea how to answer that. I have an answer, but it doesn't directly do with caste.
That's great. I mean, I don't like easy pat answers. They really bother me. Because either we haven't thought about it enough, or it's not worth asking. So the more complex your answer, the more gravitas you bestow upon the question.
I mean, I guess there are kings who shift castes like Vishwamitra, but I can't even say. I mean, that's your territory, Arshia. But different castes, I don't know actually. I mean, I haven't looked deeply into looking at different kings of different castes. But the figure that has fascinated me in recent times is the poet king, or the king who writes. And I think they have a very different approach to kingship, whether it is Mahendravarman Pallava, or it is Krishna Devaraya, who himself is a poet. The kind of, these are, I love these kings because they create courts of startling aesthetic beauty. I mean, Mahendravarman Pallava is responsible for all this gorgeous architecture that we have. And the some of his plays, I mean, when I read them, they're so subversive. They so question ideas of orthodoxy. They verge on the blasphemous. And I'm like, wow, I want this free, expressive, creative kingship model to come back. And when I read, and the other reason I'm interested in, I mentioned Krishna Devaraya is he also brings to his court, and I'm going to pronounce her name wrong, so forgive me, Mullah or Molla. And she is a woman of the Potter caste. She is a Dalit woman in today's terms. And he gives her the access to the tools to write, and I mean, to create her own poetry, and she creates a version of the Ramayana. So I think that's a wonderful story as well. So I'm not sure about the different castes, but I would like to see more poet kings, because I think they do interesting things.
You know, our prime minister is a poet.
I haven't read his poetry, I have to confess.
Yeah. Me neither, but it's published.
That's too much, Arshia. That's too much.
Yes. The other leader who's published is what, Vaclav Havel. It'd be interesting to read both side by side.
Yeah, but that's why, you know, yeah.
That's that poets with integrity and poets without, I suppose.
And some better than others. Forget integrity. Some people are just more talented poets than others. Yeah.
Yes.
So the more complicated question about, which I think really boils down to, if we acknowledge dharma and karma as operators in our lives, what happens to free will? I think that really is the nub of the question. And, you know, I mean, God, James and I have been trying to answer that for as long as we've known each other, which is not that long, but it's at least a couple of years. You know, where is free will? Where does individual choice lie in a universe like the Hindu or the Buddhist universe, which is so determined by a series of obligations that you have, and the fact that your everything, your position, your caste, your gender, your choices are determined by what you've done in your past life, right? I think Jainism and Buddhism have a much more rigid construction of karma than Hinduism does, right? And I think, again, the epics are places, you know, just as epics explore the natural tension between ruling castes, between priests and warriors, so also the epic narrative really plays with the possibility of what comes first, dharma or karma, which is more important, dharma or karma. And every character carries those burdens, you know. I mean, one of my favorite examples of karma and dharma, like really, you know, combining to create an untenable situation, is Dasharatha and Rama, right? Dasharatha said to his wife, I will send my son into the forest, my best beloved son, because you asked me to. Now, we might be critical of Dasharatha for this, but no, you know what happened? Many years ago, he had promised Kaikeyi 2 boons, right? She was just redeeming them. So he was obliged, right, to honor his word as a husband, and obviously as a royal husband, not as, like, you know, some other low life like us husband, right? But, you know, we could criticize Dasharatha again, that he forwent his duty as a king because he loved his wife so much. But you know what happened one day when Dasharatha was a young man? He was in the forest and he thought he was shooting an elephant, but it turned out to be a young man that he had shot. And the parents of that young man cursed Dasharatha, and they said, you too, you will die of grief for your son. Your son will be taken away from you. That is why Dasharatha, you know, all these things, his past karma and his dharma all came together to make sure that actually there was only one choice, that he had to send Rama to the forest, right? But what about Rama's karma? His father's karma is being visited upon him. And he has a choice. Is he going to be the good son and obey his father? Or is he going to make the equally rightful choices? Like, you know what? I am the heir apparent. I am the elder son. Yeah, you know my father was going to make me king. And that's what Lakshmana tells him. He's like, don't listen. Don't listen. He's not the king anymore. Right? And Rama chooses to be more peaceable, to take the choice that will be less disruptive, to society, to life in the palace and everything. So did Rama act out of free will? I think he did. Did Dasharatha actually act out of? I think he did, but there is something very scary to ruling elites about the possibility of free will. No, because then we can all do whatever we want. So I think very much dharma and karma are used as control mechanisms for us all, and we are persuaded that we don't have free will, but of course we do.
That's a very interesting answer.
I didn't know where it came from, actually, quite honestly.
And then in all of this, there's destiny, right?
Of course there is, yeah.
There's destiny. I mean, there's that other sort of, you don't know where it came from, but somehow that was the little straw you drew.
Yep.
And where does that play into all of these questions is so fascinating.
Ramanujan taught us when we were studying epic with him, and he was, of course, a great structuralist. I mean, he's trained in linguistics, and I know that his personal preference was for structuralism as a primary approach to literary text, and what you do with it afterwards, you can apply various other things. But he said the narrative drivers, the narrative operators in the Indian epics are karma, dharma, boons and curses, the gods, and vidhi meaning destiny, right? So those are the four narrative operators, that determine and define what happens to characters. And of course, if you're looking at like so many factors, then what you end up with is an over-determined universe of action. And then what happens to free will?
Yes.
But I mean, this is not simply a Hindu or a Buddhist problem. I mean, Western philosophies struggle with free will as much as any other philosophies. And yeah, I mean, free will is one of the great unresolved articulations of humanness. Yeah.
I was just, when you were talking about this, I was thinking about that Par and Maryada where you talk about Jabali. Isn't that his name?
Yeah, Jabali.
Yeah. And the Charvaka perspective.
Yeah.
And how that seems to suggest that if you abandon all of the relationships, right, then you have free will.
Yes. That's beautiful. But again, that's a very Hindu response, because the Hindu self is a relational self, right? That your dharma choices are determined by, I mean, in this moment, the three of us certainly, we are fulfilling our dharma as public intellectuals or readers or whatever, but simultaneously we are giving up the dharma of, my mom could be on the phone. I'm like, no, ma, I'm an intellectual at the moment. I'm not going to be your daughter. I can't take your call or whatever it is, right?
I have my cat next to me right now. I can't be a cat mother.
No, but that's it. No, so if we give up our relations, then we are truly free. Jabali is a great character, much maligned, either maligned or ignored, because look how subversive he is, man. I mean, it's really amazing to say that give up all your relations. Bizarrely, that is the definition of a sannyasi. A sannyasi is so free because they don't have a family to whom they have to respond,
Yes.
Yeah.
One of my, I shouldn't tell the story, but I'm going to, one of our uncles, Sam, my mother told me, decided one day he was going to become a sannyasi, and he left after a big hullabaloo in the house. He said, I'm leaving, this is it. And then his wife said, oh, phew, he's gone. And then a little while later, he's back. So it started raining. I forgot my umbrella.
That's a brilliant story. That is a truly, truly brilliant story.
Right. It's not so easy,
But I was actually thinking just now what Arshia said and what you were saying, Indi. like in the context of gender particularly, and this idea of destiny being marriage for a Hindu woman, right, growing up in this hierarchy. I've been recently thinking, talking to I was talking to one of my friends about dating websites and how they're constantly after you to date somebody, but that actually the freest choice to make in this time is to be single.
Brilliantly 21st century pandemical response, Sam.
The dharmic response.
Yes. Well, we're sort of coming towards the end of it. Do we have any further comments on kingship in the context of all these elections that are hitting us in the face with absolute lack of morality that we are confronted with? Anything further to say that we haven't said already? I just think that the interesting thing in the epics and also in the later plays and stories and tellings of the lives of kings is there is it's always positioned as an examination that the king has to make about his place and his relationship with power. There is no absolute power because you're always having to review that, evaluate that. And that's what you lose, I think, in contemporary times. Nobody seems to have that, nobody has to answer to that idea.
But I think our contemporary kings are ruled by ambition, which is what makes them want to be kings in the first place. And they cannot be free or autonomous without that desire.
That's right. And go ahead.
I was also thinking of another thing when you were saying that, which was what the Ramayana has, what the Shilapatikaram has, is both these family quarrels that turn into these catastrophic things that affect everybody, right? Whether it's the Shilapatikaram or the Ramayana, the actions of the king, that the dynamics between the family are what gets played out in the nation itself. And you can even,
that's the biggest family fight of them all, man.
Yeah. So when you look at Trump and his relationships with his family, or you look at Biden and Biden's relationship with his families, or what has happened in the Biden family is very interesting and complicated. You wonder whether these dynamics will play out.
Yeah, and
because in Biden's case it already has, in Trump's case it already has.
Right. And with Kamala Harris, she's going to have the whole weight of South India with her.
And all of us who claim connections.
I don't know any Kamala, as we call her. Yeah, Kamala.
That's right. Well, I think we're sort of devolving into being silly now. So
it's been a long and intense session. My brain is getting a bit spaggy.
Arshia, you didn't talk about kingship with today's election. I was curious to hear your perspective.
Yes.
I think both of you said everything that really needs saying. Okay, so here's the other thing I think that's going on. You brought up the thing of Biden and Trump and their families, right? And that is the Kaikayi question, right? That I'm in a position of power. How do I secure the prosperity of my children, right? So her idea is like, let it be king. Whatever Trump has done with Ivanka is similar, and Jared Kushner, whatever. Trump's life is littered with examples of nepotism. And on the other hand, across the world, far, far away, in a country far, far away, look at what the downfall of the Gandhi family has been, again, predicated on our feeling that, the party hierarchy is nepotistic, that whether you're competent or not, this is your Jagir beta, you will have it till the day you die. And in contrast to that, you can see what our current prime minister is doing. No family, right? He cannot be corrupt because he is incorruptible. He has done the business of Jabali. He has no family ties. So that is what we're being asked to believe, that narrative. And whether we do or not is what makes a difference to the kinds of elections that we have in this country. Obviously, most of our country people believe that narrative, that this is a good government, this is a government of many virtues. And so he keeps, that really is his calling card. That's his election calling card. So again, the ideal of the ascetic has not gone anywhere, really. And it becomes a yardstick by which we judge whether we're judging Biden or Trump. It's like, itne paise hain, he gave his daughter a job, but the ascetic somehow is like, oh, already better. So,
and may I just add that nepotism, as the word itself, nephew, my aunt is the moderator of this panel. It is rampant in everywhere.
As well, I'm here to make honest women of both of you, man.
Well, on which note, I think we should probably draw to an end of this wonderful session. It's always such a pleasure to talk to both of you. I'm so happy that both of you are at G5A. I'm one of the few people connected with G5A who still has a G5A mug that began around the time that both of you first began to connect with the center. You have such a long history with it that we haven't fully used to the maximum, that all the wonderful, wonderful things that one could do together is yet to evolve. This is just a fantastic beginning. This was a fantastic conversation because I think it addressed so many complicated, different aspects of leadership, kingship, relationship to power, relationship to spirituality, from the two of you who are just too fantastic and fine, and who have fantastic and fine books that surely must be read. And I'm not going to babble on because then I'll just get sentimental. And I just want to say I'm so pleased you're here at G5A, which is always moving forward towards the best ideals of civic society.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Arshia.
Thank you, G5A.
I don't want to say bye. I want to keep chatting.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anuradha. Thank you, Ishan. Thank you, Shraddha. Thank you, everybody who made this happen. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.